So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay,
So,
Caroline.
yeah, ready when you are, Andrew.
That's right. I'm going to just start sharing my screen. So if you could let me know, Caroline, that it's all up and running, and then we'll start the show. So can you see that presentation front page, Caroline?
Not yet, no. Oh, yep, we're up and running now.
Really good. Right, good morning, everybody. As Caroline said, my name's Andrew Hoppit, and I've been working with the Forestry Commission for a few too many years. Though I've been having a role with the Oak Processionary Moth project since 2012. Before I get into my presentation, though, I'd just like to say thanks to a number of people who do a phenomenal amount of work on OPM. We have an in-house team of Millie Toft, Jill Brown and Teresa Jennings, and they provide an awful lot of support for this programme. But also we have a contract with Southampton University, who do a lot of the database and geographical information systems background to it all. And furthermore, we work with forest research colleagues, specifically entomologist Dr. Max Blake and also Dr. Nigel Straw. So I just want to say a big thank you to all of them. So when I was looking through the list of attendees to today's session, there was a number of people I recognised who a lot of what I'm about to say will be well known and well rehearsed with them. But I really do have to go back through some of the history so that people do understand what we're trying to do with OPM. But also I'm looking forward to what happens with the coming season, and that's actually already started with evidence gathering. In fact, I was just out yesterday with some surveyors down in the Dorking area. But really there's 5 main issues that we're looking at when it comes to the OPM programme, and we know that OPM is here to stay, but we're just trying to limit the rate of spread and also really reduce its footprint. So that's one of the key drivers for the programme that we're doing. Also deal with any new findings that maybe could become a new outbreak. And actually, as we go through this talk, there's a number of areas within the southeastern London area which we had some more incursions in 2020, but also I've got a specific case study over the Merseyside area a bit later on. So there's 3 aspects to the control programme. There's actually doing something, that's actually trying to control the caterpillar, but there's also, we can't control it unless we know where it is, so we do a lot of looking for it, so survey work. There's also a lot of comms, communications, and actually days like today are part of that education, shall we say. But also, we also look forward to other aspects within the programme, and so we're also dealing with evidence. So work closely with DEFRA policy colleagues on that, so things like defoliation, the effectiveness of what we're doing, and also building on partnerships. And in fact, I've just recently been liaising with a partnership in Kent to maybe use their volunteer resource to do some work on gathering evidence on OPM for us. So I said there's going to be a little bit of a history lesson, so now it starts. And so where did OPM come from into this country? Well, it was first observed in 2006. No, oh dear, that's no, not 2016, 2006. Almost certainly was here in 2005 because the trees were planted in 2005, and they were found in just to the north of Kew Gardens, but also Hanger Lane. So that's in West London. And we know that those trees that were planted came from a Dutch supplier. But also, what's also interesting about these nurseries is how much trade there is actually internally. And we know, for example, that a lot of the oak trees that are supplied by the Dutch nurseries actually come from Italian nurseries. So it just gives you an appreciation of how much trade there is in plant material. So this is a bit of a messy map. Well, that actually maybe just shows you how much data we've got on OPM. So if you look at right in the middle, you can see a yellow lozenge shape. That's trying to show you where we found it in 2006. So to the south is Kew, to the north is Hanger Lane. And you can see over the years that it's been slowly spreading outwards. And also you can sometimes see that we've had some isolated findings. So in 2014, for example, it spread further into Guildford, and that was actually a finding that was reported to us by the Royal Horticultural Society at their site at Wisley. Anyway, so going forwards now to last year, and the blue line on the outside gives you a real understanding of now where we think OPM has got to. So to the north, Luton, but also to the south, going towards Gatwick Airport, but also heading towards Basingstoke, and also now going out into the Thames estuary as well. So what I find interesting about OPM is looking back at some of the historical presentations, and this slide was actually from a presentation that Dr. Nigel Straw did in 2011. And what he was trying to tell us in this slide is what he thought the likelihood of OPM's distribution would be from 2020 going onwards. So I'm just going to flip back to the previous slide and now go forwards again. So what we're looking at is actually an interesting aspect in that Nigel seemed to think that OPM in 2025 would be that second circle going outwards, and actually that's where we are now. It's actually gone a bit further than even he was predicting. But what's also interesting is he said that the spread would be around about 3 kilometres a year from 2011 to 2020, and then it would change to 7.5 kilometres a year. Well, actually that 7.5 kilometres a year has changed, and that actually seemed to occur about 2 or 3 years ago. And I've been working with some modelers at Cambridge University where we've got the evidence to show that actually it did bubble away at around about 3 kilometres a year and then has taken off. And that's apparently quite a standard thing for insects to do in terms of getting established and then doing exploration. So at the moment we think that OPM is spreading at around about 7.5 kilometres a year. So OPM, it's got a 1-year life cycle, and again it's a bit of a cluttered slide that we're looking at here, but what we'll do is we'll start in late August going into September, and that's when the eggs are laying on the twigs of oak trees, and it is only oak trees that the life cycle of opium has ever been observed on. And it tends to be lay the eggs on the periphery of the tree on twigs maybe the size of your little finger. And for 8 months of the year, it's just dormant. So from September through to March going into April, they're doing nothing. Now, this is where it gets a bit complicated to explain because the emergence of the caterpillar is very variable. But in terms of this graphic, we're saying sometime in April it emerges, and then it goes through these what we call instars, and that's stages of development. It goes through 6 stages of this development, and we've tried to represent that with these 6 shaded squares, which go through from, as I say, from April through to July. So when the caterpillar emerges, it's obviously very small, and for the first 3 stages, it actually is very susceptible to a biopesticide called Bacillus thuringiensis, BT for short. Then from stages 4 to 6, it becomes more robust and is much more difficult to control with this biopesticide. It then pupates, and that can be for a number of weeks. Turns into a moth, and the moth has no feeding parts, only lives for a couple of days, lays its eggs, and the cycle starts again. So I've been in conversation with colleagues within plant health, within the plant health forestry team, but also with people within DEFRA about the programme going forwards for 2021. And we've agreed a programme of £1.7 million. and that's roughly split 50-50 on observations for of OPM, but also for the control of OPM. But there's also two other aspects to this, which are actually quite expensive as well. As you can see, there's actually, looking for the OPM and how we actually then report it. That's the database support, and there's also the research and evidence work that we're doing along with communications. So the picture you see on the right hand side is a leaflet that we have for OPM, and actually if you want to have some of these leaflets, we've got plenty, so please drop an email to Caroline if you'd like a batch for distribution. That'd be very useful. So this is what the egg plaques look like. There's nothing particularly exciting about this. They're laying in clusters of around about 200 eggs. 90% of those will emerge. So there's not really much more to say. Very difficult to see them. As you can see, they're the same colour as the twig itself. And actually surveying for egg plaques is not a good use of one's time. That being said, there's a big thank you to the team at Richmond Park, and especially Gillian Jonasis. So every year they've very kindly looked for egg plaques for us and told us actually when they have been emerging. And as you can see on the right hand side, there's a number of dates over the last 6 or 7 years now. So the earliest we've ever observed it was actually in the 3rd week of March, on the 21st of March. And then the latest we've ever seen it was on the 16th of April. So that's a 4-week difference, and that was in 2018. And of course, with the weather conditions as they are at the moment, that reflected in what happened in April 2018, in that was the beast from the East year, which was later than it is now, and that really did help hold back the development of OPM. So the picture on the right, on the left-hand side, is actually the caterpillars just as they've emerged. They're maybe about 2 millimeters in length. And what's interesting is that they have this facility for going into a torpor, waiting for the buds of the oak tree to emerge, because they then feed on the oak leaves itself. But at the moment they've emerged, but the oak hasn't broken senescence. So they go through these stages of development, and what you're seeing here is them getting slightly bigger, starting to get this rather gregarious nature, coalescing, and this is probably about stage 3 of the development. And this is when they start to become more obviously visible, late May really. And so this is a picture where I very sensibly took the photo and got Millie to hold the pound coin as the scale. So what you're seeing here is the caterpillar is actually quite low down on the tree. This is in Richmond Park. Again, they've got this rather gregarious nature. At the very bottom of the picture, you can see the frass, that's caterpillar poo, and just really starting to form a nest of opium. Here's a bit of a close-up. What's interesting is you see these very long wispy hairs. Those aren't actually something to be concerned about, and I'm going to talk a bit more about the public health aspects of opium, but these long hairs are not the toxic hairs that actually cause the rash. But what you're saying here is the caterpillar is going through later stages of development, maybe stage 5, and that would be from mid-June roughly. So there's been a number of conversations I've had with people about, why does OPM do this procession? And so you're looking at really 2 forms of procession here. The one on the left-hand side, you can see that that's a single file of OPM, and there's lots of silken threads. So that's where they're travelling up and down the trunk of the tree to feed on the oak leaves. And the picture on the right-hand side is perhaps more typical, where there's maybe 3, 4, or 5 in width, and the theory is that this actually makes the caterpillars look rather large and very difficult to attack. So a singular caterpillar would be more difficult. It's a bit like the murmurations of starlings. It makes it very difficult to actually predate or gives the predator something to think about. So when we're looking for opium, we don't really start until really June, because that's when we start to get this nest formation. The picture on the left hand side is about as easy as it's ever going to be to find opium. You've got the white nest at the very bottom of the picture, and then this very clear silken trail, and if you follow that silken trail, it will take you to where they're feeding. The picture on the right hand side is a nest which is slightly older and has become discoloured, and that's more typical and actually much more difficult to see because it starts to turn into the same colour as the actual bark of the oak tree. So again, we're looking at the procession of the caterpillars on the left hand side, and a method of control which we're seeing here is actually an industrial vacuum cleaner, the same type of vacuum cleaner that you would use in asbestos removal. And then on the right hand side, we've got a very large nest, almost the size of a rugby ball, to the extent where they start to become so heavy, if the weather conditions are wet, they can actually literally drip out of the tree. I don't know how well you can see, but on your screens, but also in the picture on the right hand side, you can see a lot of foliar feeding. That's where the caterpillars have been eating the oak leaves. In terms of nest sizes, the actual nest could be the size of a 50p piece, or as I say, maybe up to the size of a rugby ball. So it really can be very variable. Now here you're looking at the actual caterpillars that have now gone into chrysalises, turned into cocoons, and you can see the shed skins are on the right hand side of the picture, and here they're just starting to think about emerging and turning into moths. And what's interesting is these can be very, very low down, sometimes in the intergrowth between actually the root collar of the oak tree and the grass sward. So that can be a real problem in terms of maybe curious animals, dogs, for example, sniffing around, and actually there have been reports of dogs being badly affected by rash from opium. What's very unlikely for people to see is actually the moths themselves. They're nocturnal, strongly attracted to light. Counterintuitively, the female is bigger but isn't so good at dispersal as the male. So the male has frequently turned up as a migrant on the south coast from continental Europe, whereas the female, which is the larger, tends not to travel particularly far. So we've observed males, for example, as far as Cambridgeshire in 2013, when actually you wouldn't have expected them to be there, and that just seemed to be natural dispersal. We have been putting up pheromone traps to note opium dispersal, but again, the pheromone trap is only catching males. It's not actually working out where a breeding population is. Nothing particularly exciting to report. It's a little brown job, the opium. Unless you're really into your moths, it's very difficult to identify with certainty what you're seeing. There's been a lot of research work on parasitism of opium, and in fact, I've got a meeting lined up with some researchers at Newcastle University, hopefully for the beginning of March, because I need to get some more information. So there's a specific parasitoid of opium called Carcelia illica, and that was first observed, I think, around about 2013, 2014 in Richmond Park. And what's been interesting about the research from Richmond Park is actually how much this parasitoid affects the breeding population of opium, to the extent where we're starting to find a significant effect on the population of opium due to this parasitic fly. There's also some further research work being done on Hampstead Heath, and I was speaking to a contractor just a few days ago who was doing some work in the Kent area where he's pretty sure that he's also observed this parasitic fly. So be interesting to see whether we can find a regime for looking for this parasitoid, because that could have an effect on things as well. We don't know how this parasitoid got into the country because it's not a native to the UK and it is specific to opium. So that's been rather interesting, and it overwinters in the nests of opium. So this is a little bit of a complex story. So if you recall at the beginning of my talk, I said that opium was introduced into this country, we think in 2005, and that was on instant planted trees. And actually, from then until last year, that's been the case. There's been a number of times where there's been incursions. So, for example, in Pangbourne in West Berkshire, Sheffield, Leeds, even the Olympic Park in the East End of London. But what was interesting is in 2019, we had a report of some OPM being found in the Solent. And if you look at the map at the very south, just where the Isle of Wight is, it says IP1. And what was interesting is we just weren't expecting to find any OPM down there. So I went and investigated the site with my colleague Millie, and they were planting some instant oak trees there. And those instant oak trees have been brought in with OPM on them. That set off a chain of events where we started to do an investigation into other batches within that planting group, which continued on and on until we had actually 2,000 investigations looking for incursions of OPM into GB. Of those 2,000 investigations, 98 of them actually returned a positive for opium. So we had, to our knowledge, 98 incursions into GB. The majority were in England, and the majority of those English ones were actually outside of the nursery trade. But there was also 3 in Wales and 6 in Scotland. We did, a robust regime of controlling those incursions, and that was by spraying all of the trees and then actually physically removing them. But even with the best will in the world, some of these sites we got to too late. So one of the sites which we managed to find OPM on, but very late on in the season, was a place called Ellesmere Port up near Merseyside. And the photo you're seeing here on the left hand side is the row of the instant trees that were planted. But we didn't actually get to investigate that site till late on in the season, and you can just see the insert is actually a moth that had flown on that site, and the picture on the right hand side is actually where the nest had formed, and that was where there was a supporting bracket on these oak trees. So what was frustrating is we knew that this was a late find of OPM, and so in 2020 we set up a system of looking at some of these sites to see whether they got into the wider environment, and unfortunately we did find evidence of a breeding population on the wider environment trees at Ellesmere Port. Again, we've done robust measures for control there, and going forwards for the coming season we'll be doing further survey work up around that area there. So this is the actual tree in Ellesmere Port where we found further evidence of opium. It's difficult to actually see the nest. The picture on the left hand side just shows you the challenge. This tree was about, 15 to 20 meters in height, so the nest was maybe 2/3 of the way up. The right hand picture is a bit more zoomed in and a bit clearer, so it's actually quite a large nest, but only the one tree that we found evidence of OPM there. And it's a light industrial site with some retail. Not a particularly interesting place to go to, but anyway, that will need further investigation going forwards. So the map you're looking at here is the sites where we've been doing a lot of OPM visual survey work and where we were concerned about incursions of OPM. So where it has 6 on the map, that's the Ellesmere Port site, but you can see there's other blue triangles, which means we did a lot of extra survey work but didn't find anything. But as we come further south, you can see that there's been some concerns. Number 2, that's a place called Ducklington near Whitney. Number 5 is Battle. 4 is a place called Burgess Hill. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a slide or two's time. 3 is around the Luton area, and then obviously going further out into the South Essex woodlands. So here's a zoom into the southeastern London area. talk about Ducklington first, I think. Yeah, that'd be the best. So Ducklington was a bit like the Ellesmere port finding. I would have used Ducklington as the example in the previous slide, but I just don't have as good photos as we've got for Ellesmere Port. But Ducklington, very similar to what happened in Ellesmere Port, in that there were some instant trees were planted in 2019. We found them rather late in the day. Further subsequent survey work found OPM on 2 large trees where we did control measures, and again we'll be doing some further survey work around the Ducklington area in 2021. The Burgess Hill site, which I haven't actually named, that's because it actually is in what we call the control zone of OPM, but only 100 metres in the control zone. But the 2 other areas which I've highlighted is Hailsham and Battle. So Hailsham is an interesting one in that it was a single Quercus cerus, that's Turkey oak, that was reported by a member of Bartlett Tree Experts who happened to just notice a young Quercus cerus in a very poor state of repair, it must be said, with OPM on it. And that was a young tree, which we think we had missed from the 2019 survey. We could find no evidence of it having spread into the wider environment. And again, we did robust measures to control that tree, but there'll be further subsequent follow-up work in 2021. But the Battle tree is very interesting in that there was a number of smallish oak trees were planted in a terrible state, in fact pretty much dead, but the person who planted them reported that they had these caterpillars on, to us. And when we did further investigation, the person bought these trees on the interweb through eBay from a South London supplier, essentially somebody's back door. So it just shows you how difficult it is sometimes to manage, the supply of these materials. We don't know actually whether the OPM came from London or whether the trees came from continental Europe to London and then out to Battle. It was just the what's the best way to describe it? We just could not work it out. We work closely with the Animal and Plant Health Agency who deal with the nursery trade, but the trail went cold on that, unfortunately. But again, you can see we're doing an awful lot of work around here, and it's just, as I said, slowly spreading in an outward direction from central London. We have a lot of reports of OPM from the public, and one of the ways that we get it is through something called Tree Alert, and you can see an exponential growth in those reports. So in 2017 there was 62. And now in the last season we had 757, a massive growth in this. And that actually just puts an awful lot of pressure on the forest research colleagues, but also the teams in the OPM, because each one of those reports has to be logged, investigated, and responded to as well. So moving on to what does OPM do to people, the public health aspects of it. So earlier on I said about the long wispy hairs not being the issue. It has these urticating hairs which are very, very small, less than 0.2 of a millimetre. I don't know where I got this information from, but there's an estimation there's around about 60,000 of these urticating hairs on each caterpillar, and they can cause a nasty rash, especially for people who work in the arboricultural sector. So I've got 4 pictures here of guest body parts. The easy ones to explain are the 3 on the right hand side. So those are people who work in the tree industry. The person whose neck is covered in rash was actually doing some nest removal, but annoyingly, didn't consider covering up their neck well enough, and ended up with a rash. Picture on the far right hand side is one of the OPM surveyors brushed up against a nest and their arm just ballooned up with rash. And the person on the bottom, that lady's neck, she's part of the Kew Gardens team and has become sensitized to OPM. The picture on the left hand side is the lady had this rash all over her body, and she lives in the Crystal Palace area of South London. no oak trees in her garden and hadn't been to the park behind her, which does have oak trees in it. However, she presented to her doctor's surgery and the doctor didn't really appreciate what was going on, but we had sent out those leaflets to the GP surgery. So he got a second consultation and the other GP had seen the leaflet and they came to the conclusion that actually she was suffering from OPM rash. And when they took a history of the lady, she started to get this rash immediately after she used clean bed linen, which had been hung up outside to dry. And the theory from the GPs was that the urticating heads had got blown into her laundry and then she had got covered in rash. And actually she was so poorly from it, she had to have over a week off off work. So we also log reports to the Forestry Commission of OPM, and I know this is a significant under-recording because I always make the point as why would you come to the Forestry Commission if you've got a health issue. But anyway, in 2014 we had 12 logged reports and that came up to 98 in the last year. Whenever I do a talk to people, especially within the ARB sector, and I ask them whether they've been affected by OPM, nearly everybody puts their hand up, but we don't actually hear about them. So it is an underreported aspect. This. And just getting towards the end of my presentation, just a couple of slides showing you the typical larval feeding damage of OPM. So it creates this almost skeleton of the leaf. So the midrib is left, normally very localized within the tree and can be sometimes quite difficult to observe. But you do get cases of significant infestation where the whole tree can be defoliated. So far in this country, nothing suggests that it's killed the trees, but it obviously does put them under stress because, for example, we're looking at a couple of trees here in Richmond Park. Again, it's not particularly obvious where there is foliar feeding, but the picture on the left-hand side at the very, very top, you can see very lightness of the crown, and that's actually to do with the OPM. And the picture on the right-hand side is more apparent, so it's the top quarter with quite a bit of foliar feeding by the OPM caterpillars. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you to lots of different organisations that have been supporting the programme over the years. I've probably missed some and maybe need to get some more logos there, but that's the talk. So thank you.
That's lovely. That's great, Andrew. Thank you for that.
Okay.
We've just got one question in the chat at the moment, which is, do you think that the increase in reports on tree alerts is due to an increased occurrence, awareness, or a combination of the two?
I'm very sure it's increased occurrence because it's geographical spread, and we've been doing a lot more presentations as it's been expanding. So, for example, this is the third presentation I've done. I did one in the southwest, I've done one for the northwest, obviously for you now in the southeast of London. So I think the message is just, getting out there more, Caroline.
Lovely. Okay. I've just got another question coming from Arno. Have we got any lures that work on the way this year?
Okay, so thanks for the question, Arno. So I didn't allude to it in my presentation, but we had some issues with the pheromone lures from our supplier. Historically, they've been excellent, this supplier, and it was frustrating that last year the formulation didn't seem to work. So we've been working with the supplier, fingers crossed that they work, but we've not actually got to the bottom of what was wrong with that. So the pheromone trapping program for 2020, unfortunately, was a write-off. But normally it's a good way of us, another aspect that we use for looking for OPM.
Okay, I've now got a question from Sarah. What percentage approximately of the reports were actually OPM and not something else?
Okay, so we had 757 reports in the tree alert system. The majority of those, and I'd really be relying on Jill and Teresa to help me here, but well over 90% will be OPM. But there are other species, and actually Forest Research has a very good guide on species to be confused with OPM.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Arno. Given the increasing spread, what is the point of continuing with SPHNs, statutory plant health notifications?
Thanks for your question, Arno. I am working with DEFRA policy on other strategies. That's not an answer I can fully what's the word I'm looking for? I can't fully answer that for you, Arno, in that there are political considerations for that matter. All I can do is report what we're finding and go down that policy route.
Okay, question from Ross. Are costs of eradication on confirmed sites covered by the Forestry Commission or the tree owner?
So at the moment, the majority of the work is actually picked up with the Forestry Commission, who are funded by DEFRA for this control programme. So if you're in what we call the control zone and you receive a statutory notice from us, the majority will have that work carried out at the Forestry Commission's expense. We actually generate a job sheet and we have a couple of suppliers who do that work for us. And in fact, that process has already started where we're contacting landowners. So for the 2021 season, we've already issued over 1,500 statutory notices, and job sheets have gone out to suppliers as well.
Okay, I've now got a question from Julie. Is OPM likely to stay as a regulated pest?
Again, that's a policy question, Julie. I just can't answer that question. It's constantly being reviewed, and there are submissions made to ministers on a regular basis by the DEFRA policy team. But at the moment, it is a regulated pest, yeah.
A question from someone called Matthew Woodcock.
Oh dear.
What has been done to reduce the chance of further imports on the planting material?
Thanks for your question, Matthew. So I don't know, maybe you could tell from the tone of some of my presentation the frustration in that we did not maybe deal with these instant trees earlier. So I said from like probably 2005 we've been bringing opium into this country. It wasn't until we had that significant outbreaks in 2019 that legislation was changed. So now, unless a country can prove that it is free of OPM, it's not impossible. They're not allowed to import trees into this country. I think it's over 1.5 or 2 meters in height and with a girth of 8 centimeters. So these instant trees are not allowed to be brought into this country, but that's a relatively new process, Matthew.
Okay, I've got another question from Julian. Are the zones static from last year or have they moved?
Hi, Julian.
I guess that's control then.
Yeah. So maybe I didn't explain these zones particularly well. So there's 3 areas that we have to consider for OPM. There's what we call the core. That's where OPM is established. That's London mostly. We then have this control zone, and that's where we're issuing a lot of the statutory notices. And then there's this outer layer, which is most of GB, which is called the pest-free area. So where we have an incursion into the pest-free area, for example, like at Elmsmere Port, we do significant work to try to eradicate it. Those zones have stayed that way for the last 4 years. I put forward scenarios each year to DEFRA policy with what we could maybe do differently, but ultimately there's a decision has taken that the zones are staying the same, and they will be the same for 2021.
Lovely, thank you. We've got a raised hand. I'm just chasing it down from Peter. Peter, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I'd heard from a colleague about the effects on animals. Sorry if I missed you mentioning that, but quite bad for horses and things potentially.
Yes, thanks for your question, Peter. So we do hear of issues, especially with dogs, who can be very inquisitive. There's a particularly nasty case where actually a dog got an old nest in Richmond Park in the middle of winter, and they ended up on the vet with the vet having to be treated for bad reaction to the toxic hairs. I've also had reports of horses being affected by opium. I don't have any visual evidence of that though, but so yes, animals are certainly affected by the urticating hairs.
Okay, I don't think there's any further questions, and unless anyone wants to quickly type something in or use the raised hand function, and we'll unmute. But yeah, I don't think there's anything else. So that was brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Andrew, and for your time. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope you found that useful. Like I said, if you missed any of this, it will be up on YouTube probably early next week. And we'll also be sending out the questionnaire just to get your feelings on how this session ran and what we can do to improve, and any other events that we might run in the future. So yeah, I will sort of close off the session, but thank you everyone for attending, and well, if anyone's still interested in coming to the spaces that we've got left for the next two sessions, tomorrow on plant passporting and also on deer on Friday, then you're still free to book on until 10 AM of the morning of the event. So thanks very much everyone, and we'll see you next time.